Okay, so today I'll explain how an action potential in a neuron works. An action potential is defined as a neuron transporting electrical signals from one neuron to the next. So on this page of paper, I'll draw out parts of the neuron, including the soma, also known as the cell body, the axon itself, and the axon terminal. In order for an action potential to occur, the neuron needs to be stimulated in some sort of way. This can be done from stretch and chemical receptors, temperature, light, and so on. These examples of stimuli cause sodium ions to rush into the cell, therefore shifting the membrane to less negative polarization. Keep in mind that resting membrane potential is around negative 65 millivolts. Inside of the neuron, when the threshold of negative 55 millivolts is reached, voltage-gated sodium channels open and allow sodium to rush into the axon hillock. So here we have our sodium channels, and these will open at negative 55 millivolts, causing sodium ions to rush into the axon. This rush of sodium causes for the membrane potential to rise inside. So down here I'll draw a graph of basically what is occurring in the axon. So at negative 65 millivolts, the membrane or the potential is basically at resting state. Then once it hits negative 55, it shoots up, and this is called depolarization. At the peak is at about positive 40 for a charge. And in this process, the sodium ions will cause an overshoot, and at that point, the sodium channels are blocked, and no more sodium ions can move inside. At this time, potassium channels are opened, allowing for potassium ions to leave the neuron. So here are the potassium channels, and they're going out of the neuron. This is causing for the membrane to shoot back down in charge, and that is called repolarization. So due to the fact that potassium channels are slow to close in comparison to the sodium channels, the membrane potential actually dips lower than resting potential, and this is called hyperpolarization. Technically, another action potential could occur at this point since the sodium channels are reopened, but it would require a much larger signal for it to occur. So the membrane would be repolarized back to its resting membrane potential due to the sodium-potassium pump attempting to get the charge back to where it began both inside and outside the cell. Keep in mind that action potential phenomenon is like a domino effect in the axon, occurring all the way down the cell. Myelin is another substance present in some neurons, and it speeds up this process by insulating the neuron. This will also increase its efficiency since it is now less likely for the signal to escape out of the neuron. And the myelin is actually almost like sheaths that cover the neuron, kind of like this. So the action potential will actually jump in between the individual sheaths, kind of like this, where it'll go in between, and the myelin will cause for an insulation of those sodium ions. So as this domino effect winds down, the action potential will reach the end of the axon, called the axon terminal. At this point, calcium ions will be able to enter the cell. This triggers neurotransmitters, which are stored in vesicles. These neurotransmitters will now be released into the synapse, which is a gap between neurons, through a process called exocytosis. So these calcium ions will cause for these little vesicles filled with neurotransmitters to activate, and then when that happens, exocytosis is basically the release of these neurotransmitters out into this called the synapse. So these neurotransmitters will be able to signal to other cells, as they'll go in this direction, where a dendrite of another neuron will exist. And this is how cells can communicate with one another.